Hi, this is Justin from SonicScoop, coming at you from my home studio this time. And thanks for joining me for this first installment in this new podcast series from SonicScoop. It's going to be coming at you every single week, and we have a lot of big plans for this podcast and videocast series. It's not going to just be me talking at you. We are going to have guests on, and not just producers and engineers, but artists, musicians, researchers, journalists, creative business people, creative entrepreneurs of all types. And we're going to get into a really cool rhythm here where every other week we're going to focus a little bit more on running a creative business, whether that's a studio or a freelance career or a career as an artist. And even if you're just into music or audio production as a hobby, I think some of the lessons we can learn in this context are going to apply no matter what kind of creative business you may be in. And then every other week, on alternate weeks, we're going to go a little deeper and a little more specific into specific music production, audio engineering, tips, technologies, tricks, advice with all sorts of great guests. But for these first couple of podcasts that I planned for you, it's just going to be me and you while we're feeling out this new format. And today I've got a great topic lined up for you. It's something that every single creative professional needs to think about. Whether you're running a studio or a freelance career, you need to know how to set your rates. How much should you charge? How do you talk about your pricing? Should you advertise those rates? When do you know it's time to change your pricing, whether upwards or downwards? You don't want to set your rates so high that you're losing a lot of business. You don't want to set them so low that your career is unsustainable. And there are also certain contexts in which lowering your price is going to lead to less business rather than more. And we'll kind of explore some of that. But before we dive in, this podcast wouldn't exist if it wasn't for our sponsors. So big shout out, first and foremost, thanks to all of them. Sound Toys, I'm wearing the shirt right now. They didn't actually send me the shirt to wear. This is my own personal Sound Toys t-shirt. I have a couple of them. Truth be told, I love Sound Toys plugins so much. I've been using them for so many years that my daughter was born a year and a half ago while I was wearing my Sound Toys hoodie. Yes, in the hospital. Her whole first day on Earth was me and my Sound Toys hoodie. I'm very, very proud of it. Some of the best plugins around. Thank you so much to Sound Toys for helping us sponsor this podcast and videocast series. And thanks also to Focusrite. You can see I'm talking into a Focusrite interface right there in the back. Again, I was going to just use a Focusrite interface I had lying around, but this time these guys actually sent me this one. They said, why not use a new one instead of a 10-year-old one that still works and sounds great? Shameless plug. So thank you guys. You are hearing me right now through a Claret 2 pre, and I've got to tell you, if you hear any noise on this podcast, it is not coming from that pre. Any noise that would be coming in this podcast is because my home studio isn't as acoustically isolated as the studio where I've done so much mastering work in the past. So if you hear anything, it'll be water coming through my pipes, maybe my heater going on, but you're not going to hear any damn noise off of this interface. Plenty of clean gain for this Shure SM7 that I'm talking into right now. Audio quality is good? Yes, it is. Speaking of good audio quality, last, definitely not least, one of the reasons this studio looks so pretty is because of all of these acoustic panels that were sent over by GIK Acoustics. So one more big shout out, big thanks to those guys. This place wouldn't look or sound half as good without these. I can do mastering work in here without having to worry about the low end, without having to worry about reflections and room modes and room nodes. I'm really glad to have this stuff up. So with those big thank yous out of the way, I'd love to dive right into our topic for today, which is all about setting rates, talking about your pricing. So I actually wrote an article on this back in 2013 and then updated it for 2017. And the context there was really about recording studios. I'll share this article with you in the show notes, but I think it's a good jumping off point for us. When it comes to recording studios, one of the questions that I get all the time is, should I advertise my rates? I see some studios do, some don't. And how do I set them? How do I come up with the right pricing structure for my place? And the questions for freelancers are slightly different than this, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But I just think this is a great place to start. So one of the interesting things when I got ready to write this article was I visited literally 30 recording studios just in Brooklyn alone. And I gathered, just for that local market, what some of the norms were. And one of the things I found, this is interesting, is that 55% of the commercial public-facing recording studios did advertise their rate. So almost half, almost a coin flip, right? So 55% of them listed their rates on their website, 45% didn't. Out of 30 studios, it's pretty close to being a coin flip. But it wasn't totally random. There were some uniting factors for all of those studios that listed their rates, and there's some uniting factors for those studios that didn't. And I'll say the studios that did list their rates tended to be the ones that were more likely to be competing on price, meaning, hey, we can deliver something to you at a lower cost than those other guys. Why don't you come down? They tended to be studios that maybe didn't have the same kind of huge client lists you'd see at the places that didn't list their rates. They tended to be studios that were maybe a little less established. Maybe they were studios that were slightly less busy and were trying to go with lower rates to try to increase just how much business they were doing. And they tended to be studios that were run by people who were maybe a little bit younger. So the average age there was definitely well under 40. Whereas for the studios that didn't list their rates, you had a lot more people in their late 30s and into their 40s and further on in their career where they weren't looking to compete based on price. So that's one of the first questions. If you're running some kind of public-facing business, then listing your rates may make sense when you're kind of young and hungry and competing on price. And if price is one of your biggest selling points, that you could do a great job at a lower price than the other guys, lead with that. But if your main selling point isn't your price, it is your track record or the fit that you're going to have with the client, then price, I don't want to say is a formality. It's not. You still have to be in budget for the particular projects that you're trying to land, but it's not what you want to lead with. That conversation can come afterwards. The big thing when you are dealing with people who are further along in their careers is whether you're a great fit for them. And then you just have to be, budget-wise within scope. Someone who's further along in their career isn't necessarily going to be, penny wise and pound foolish. People who are just starting in their careers are looking for the low cost option might be a bit more penny wise about their project. So again, whether you're going to advertise your rates or not really depends a little bit on your context. If you're just starting up and you're competing on price, it might make sense to do it. Once you get to a point though where you're pretty busy and you're looking to raise your rates, maybe it's, time to put that conversation on hold for later. So what were some of the norms of these 30 studios just in Brooklyn alone? And we'll talk about pricing in other markets and how that's going to be different. So at the studios that did list their prices with an engineer, the numbers range from a low of $400 a day to a high of $825 per day. That was when I first did this in 2013. The numbers have gone up slightly since then, maybe about 10% overall in these, past 5 years from the original piece. I actually have some updated numbers in the 2017 version of this. So the median price there for these studios that did list their rates was about $600 a day. And then the average was a little bit lower, $580. So the average was slightly lower than the median because at the bottom there were a few studios that were really cheap. At that point, $250. Those cheapest studios, though, by the time I revisited this article, had either disappeared or raised their prices. It's not really a price range to stay at. The most common prices there for studios, this is a full day with an audio engineer or producer in there, were $400, $600, and $650 a day. And those numbers kept on cropping up then. And again, the numbers are slightly higher now by about 10% or so. So the studios that didn't list their prices, their base rates tended to be above the highest rates that you found at the studios that did list their prices. So the highest prices we were finding at studios that did list their prices, $825, $850. And those studios that didn't list their rates, they were often starting around $1,000 or $1,500 a day. So almost double the prices or more of those studios that did list their rates. Some of the studios in Brooklyn and the greater New York City area were commanding even more, $2,000, $3,000 a day, not unheard of. So you can see two totally different scales. And there are so many different ways you can price your product. not just as a studio, but as a freelancer, as someone who's dealing with other creative people, who's interfacing with other creative businesses. I mean, you could charge $15 an hour and struggle to get it, right? Or you could charge $150 and be booked all the time. Or you could try to charge $150 and never get a booking. You could charge $15, not have a life at all, and phone's ringing off the hook, and you got to start thinking about raising your rates. So how do you find the right point for you, the right niche? Well, one quick thing I want to mention is that obviously New York City is not the same as the rest of the world. Things are a lot more expensive, in large part because real estate is more expensive, and in some part because taxes are more expensive, and there's a whole bunch of factors that lead it to being more expensive than other places, at least right now. So a studio that costs $500 to $800 a day, that kind of lower to median price in Brooklyn, if you're in a smaller market, maybe that same room could be $400, $450, $500 a day. So Chicago, interestingly, you take a place like Steve Albini's Electrical Audio or John McIntyre's Soma Music Studios, you can find these kind of top tier studios for those cities back when I wrote this originally in the $500 to $800 a day range. And now rates, are a little bit higher than that, but it's not, really crazy so in the past 5 years since the original numbers. So if you want a really big, good, detailed, more granular breakdown of these numbers with the changes over the years, you can check out this article, and I'll put it there in the show notes. But this is really just a kind of jumping off point to think about how to come up with your rates. How do you know where your rates belong? So there are, I would say, 3 broad strategies for figuring out how much you should charge. And the first is to look at what other people are charging, who have maybe comparable experience, comparable skills, comparable track records, comparable social skills maybe too, and say, how much are these people charging? And maybe I want to undercut them just slightly, is a popular strategy, especially when you're not busy and looking to get busy. Or you can try to establish yourself at a slight premium and sell yourself as being, a kind of premium provider compared to some of the other options in the same general price range. So that's one way of going about it. And it's a decent enough way of going about it. But those prices are not necessarily going to be prices that are sustainable for you or make the most sense for you. If you were to start like a really big venture, like say that you want to quit your day job tomorrow and go into music production or audio engineering or whatever creative work you might do, a photo studio, whatever it is, you want to go into it full time, you need to plan a little bit more specifically than that. And this second strategy is to figure out what your total overhead is. So your personal living expenses, how much you pay in rent, how much you pay in groceries, how much you pay in car insurance, health insurance if you've got it, how much you pay for commercial space if you're creating a commercial space. What are your average maintenance costs or new gear acquisition costs likely to be? So you come up with a monthly number. You figure out how much all this stuff is going to cost you, let's say on a monthly basis, on a weekly basis, on a daily basis, and then you charge more than that. All right. So that's a little cheeky, but yeah, how much more than that? And what do you based on? Like how many hours? Here's the interesting thing. Here's the strategy I came up with for readers that I think was pretty conservative. So you'd pick a rate that would exceed your combined total of personal and business expenses by at least 10% if you were booked only half of the time. So that means 3.5 days out of the week, 15 days a month. That's about 140 to 150 billable hours per month, say something like that. Say you're doing, 10-hour days, fairly conventional recording studios, or maybe 8-hour days. If you were booked only 15 days out of every month, what is the rate that you would need to charge so that you would exceed those expenses by at least 10%? For some of you might be thinking, well, that's setting the bar a little too low. I expect to be booked more often than just half the time, right? And I've got to say, you'd be amazed at how many studios, even good studios, fail to consistently hit that target of really being booked with billable hours for half of the time. And, of course, some studios, are booked 80 hours a week, all the time. And some engineers are booked 80 hours a week a lot. But usually it can be a bit feast or famine if you're in that scenario where someone might get signed on to a big project, they're working like crazy, and then that project is over and there's downtime in between. So averaged out over the course of the year, I'm not saying you should expect to only work half of the time. I'm saying if that happens, you want to make sure that your business is still sustainable, because most creative businesses will go through that kind of period where they're only booked half of the time. They wish they were booked more often. And you want to make sure that when you go through those periods, you are still sustainable, still profitable. In fact, there are other methods recommended by people who maybe have studied this even a little more deeply than me that are a little bit more conservative. One book on starting your own recording studio put out a similar kind of formula. And they came out with what they said was a very traditional and very conservative method. And that's to choose a rate where you would reach your break-even point if you were billing 25 hours a week or 100 hours per month. So by this more traditional measure, a very successful studio is one that would be landing an average of 40 hours a week or more. So let's pretend that your whole monthly nut, let's use a big round number, is $4,000 per month. You would want to make sure that you were hitting all of those expenses, including salaries, how much you're going to pay yourself, off of just 100 hours per month. So there you get a number of, what's that? $40 an hour, right? If you are billing 100 hours per month and you're able to charge $40 an hour, that's $4,000 a month. That is covering your expenses as well as a salary that you're paying yourself. Now, that's not a ton of money, $48,000 per year. So, hopefully you'd do better than that, depending on what market you're in. In some places, that kind of money will go further than others. Definitely not a super sustainable amount to support a space on and yourself on in a city like New York. But in some smaller markets, those are round numbers that might actually be applicable. So for my, calculation that I'm giving you guys, where I say pick a rate where if you're booked 140 to 150 hours per month, you're still going to be, say, making 10% above your break even, so you actually have some profit in your business. Then let's say you have a studio that books a very humble $400 a day. If you're booked 15 days out of the month, that'd be something like $73,000 per year with some built-in room for upgrading because you have that 10% cushion. So I hope I'm not throwing too much math at you all at once, and I hope this is fairly comprehensible. That kind of number, 15 days per month, could get you close to, say, the 70,000 a year mark, which is, somewhat sustainable. But, depending on where you are, maybe you'd shoot more for that, $50,000 a year price range if you're in a small market, or maybe if you're actually ambitious, you want to make more than that. And there are plenty of people in the studio and audio world making more than $100,000 a year, or charging rates where if they're booked all of the time, they would be making $100,000 or more per year. And instead of making a ton of money, they choose to just work less and just take on the projects that they like. All right. So now we need to think about when you should raise your rates. And I'd say if you're consistently booked to 90% of your capacity based on a 40-hour work week, raise your rates. Just do it. give yourself a break. If you are not booked anywhere near capacity, you could think about lowering your rates for some time until you have enough clients where you're in this position where you can justify raising your rates. So if you're struggling, if you're having trouble getting booked at 50% capacity, lower your advertised rates by 10%. Once you start getting more clients in, clients beget clients. And it's one of those things in the creative professions where feast or famine really is a thing. If you're working on a lot of projects, you have more people saying to others, hey, I just did this project with this guy or gal. You got to check them out. Now, here's the one thing, the disclaimer I want to give is if you're thinking about, say, opening something like a recording studio or a business where you're going to have additional expenses, I wouldn't even think about doing that unless you're already booked as a freelancer 50% of the time. You want to be able to hit the ground running. Recording studios and really any kind of studio, any type of creative business with overhead, they don't really operate on a if you build it, they will come basis. They really operate much more on if they're coming, then you should build it basis. So that's something to think about as well. And then there's a third way to think about setting your rates. And I think as you get more advanced, it's maybe the best way to think about setting your rates. And not just as a studio or as a freelancer, but just in business in general. And that is to think about, hey, what is this product that I'm giving worth to the other person on the other end? What is the value of me doing this to the best of my ability? How much more will they make, or how much more satisfied will they be if I'm able to deliver a product at a certain level? And then what would they be willing to pay for you being the perfect answer to all of their questions? And that might be a lot more than the average rate. And I think that's what you find at the upper ends of this industry or any other. Those studios that are billing, a few $1,000s, it's not just based on price competition and overhead costs, although that factors into it. It's based to a degree on how much value am I delivering to the end client? And how can I figure out ways to deliver even more value so they'd be excited to pay more money because they're getting so much more out of it on the other end? Now, I know it's really uncommon to talk in podcasts in so much detail about money, specific numbers, how much should you charge? It gets some people a little anxious. Some people will look at where they are and see how far they are from where they want to be in terms of earning. Some people will look at some of the examples that I put out there and think the numbers are too low or way too high. And there really are so many different niches and so many different price ranges where you can find a home for yourself. But the biggest thing long-term is to make sure that it's sustainable. And sustainable in terms of business really does mean profitable. If profitable is a dirty word to you, don't let it be. Profit just means gain, means how much better off are we from having done something compared to not doing it. Profit just means how much better off are we. Now, it's a little annoying that, we count it in money. And, there's so many important things in life other than money. But, for the purpose of running a business, what are you going to count it in? Hugs? So money is a good stand-in for all the other ways that you can gain in life. Is it a perfect one? No. But you do want to get into a situation where the income is sustainable. Now, with that said, when you're first starting off, sustainability isn't always the thing. Sometimes you can operate at a loss for a little while if you're trying to start a new business that has promise of sustainability in the future. Now, SonicScoop is a good example. Right now, I'm part owner in this company. I work as, the director of content, and I get to write articles and edit articles and, talk to people about audio and music half of my week. And the other half of the week, I'm, mastering records. But when I first started out with SonicScoop, I wrote my first 3 articles for free. Is that sustainable? Not really. I mean, maybe if I have another major source of income and I'm just doing it for fun or to drive traffic to my other businesses. But after doing a few of them for free, I just wanted to do it to get the experience. But after doing a few of them, the then owners of the company said, can you do more of these? We'd like to pay you. And then once I started doing 1 a month, they said, can you do 2 a month? We'll pay you more. And they said, can you do 3 a month? We'll pay you more. And really what I was thinking about at first was just developing the skills, developing the track record. But after doing a few stories for free, I figured once I've done 3 stories for free, either I should be good enough that I should be charging for what I'm doing, or I should realize this just isn't going to work for me and I should cut my losses and say, well, at least I tried writing. I always wanted to. Similar thing happened when I moved into mastering, is I charged a little less than I think the value of the product was because I really wanted to get comfort with the craft by working on a lot of projects. And I wanted to get the clientele. I'd been mixing for ages and recording for ages, but I'd never really mastered. So, the first few things I did very inexpensively. And to be honest, the first few records I mastered, man, I remember one of the first projects I ever mastered. It was a 4-song EP. And although I had been working in audio for years and years, mixing and all that stuff, I hadn't really mastered professionally yet. And I was so critical of myself. And I second-guessed myself so much that to do those 4 tracks, oh my goodness, it probably took me all day. It was probably a 10 or 12-hour day mastering and remastering these 4 tracks each and every way. And now these days, although I budget, an hour per track when I'm mastering, sometimes I can get through, 4 tracks in less than an hour. It really depends. But here's the funny thing. What's happening now is my clients aren't paying me based on an hourly rate. They are paying me based on the value of the tracks. And if they can pay the rate that I ask and walk away saying, that was money well spent. I'm so happy with the way this came out. And this is negligible compared to either how much money we're going to make on this when we sell it for those who are, successful artists, or this is negligible compared to the amount of enjoyment and artistic and creative satisfaction I've gotten out of the process, or that amount of money is negligible compared to how much coaching Justin gave me. I asked him for all this feedback on my mixes, how to improve what I'm not hearing in my room. That's what they're paying for. And if it took me 1 minute to master their track and they were super happy, that rate would be justified. Now, of course, it usually doesn't take me 1 minute to master a track, but I think you get the idea. At a certain point, it's not necessarily about setting an hourly rate. It's about setting maybe project rates that really make sense, where someone walks away having paid that rate, and they're not thinking about in terms of how much was this per hour, how much was this compared to the competition. They're thinking about how much was that job worth compared to how much was the money that I had to give up. And I think as you get more advanced, you look at it that way. Now, as you do start to get more advanced, it can be sensible to get management involved. If you're busy, it can be nice to offload this money, this mercenary rates conversation that I'm going into so much detail on now. It can be nice to offload this to some kind of manager. And Joe Lambert Mastering still manages all of my clients. I still do all of my attended sessions there at JLM, where you've seen me do so many videos before. I master here at my home studio now as well, for unattended sessions. And no matter who comes through, still our studio manager, Diana, she is handling all those rate conversations for me. I don't even know anymore specifically what my rates are for all sorts of different little things and different projects. She handles that conversation to offload it. So you're not having to have this conversation and to play almost the bad guy of I have to take your money now with your clients. You're going to have creative conversations with your clients, and someone else is helping with that. Now, if you have a significant other or a business partner, who can take over that on that part for you from the get-go, that's great too. You don't necessarily have to wait till you're super established to kind of start working in that slightly more professional way where someone else is helping you with all of the billing and you're just taking care of the creative tasks that you need to do. Well, that's been a lot of me yammering, but I hope you enjoyed this first podcast videocast where we talked all about how to set your rates, how to talk about your rates. One other thing you'll notice here is for the first time, I'm occasionally reading some notes. I hope it's not too distracting for you guys when I look away from the camera. If you are watching this on video on our YouTube channel, that's youtube.com/SonicScoopVideo. Before we sign off here, let's look at my notes to see if there's any other major things we want to talk about. No, I think that's it. So just a quick recap. This podcast, it's new. Get it on iTunes or wherever you subscribe to your podcasts. Like and subscribe on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/SonicScoopVideo. Follow, like, comment on Facebook. If you have ideas for guests that we should have on, if you have ideas for topics we should go over, please let me know all about them. You can shoot us an email at podcast@sonicscoop.com if you have a great idea for a guest or request for a topic, or please leave comments on the YouTube channel, youtube.com/SonicScoop video, or please like, rate, and subscribe on iTunes, wherever else you might get your podcasts. So real quick bullet points recap. Should you advertise your rates? If you're a public-facing business and you're competing on price, maybe. If you're a freelancer, it's less essential even when you're starting out to lead with rates. As you get more established, rates are a conversation that can happen afterwards. The initial conversation is not about price. It is about connection. It's about saying, are we the right fit? And now price will be a little bit of a formality. And one thing I should mention is those most expensive studios were often the ones with a little bit more wiggle room on price in their downtime. Studios that are already cheap often have trouble wiggling even further down. Once you have decided on your pricing, when do you move up on your pricing? I would say if you're booked 90% of the time, absolutely move up in your pricing. If you're booked less than 50% of the time, maybe think about cutting it to see if that is the problem. And if cutting it doesn't help, well, maybe look for a different line of work or take the George Costanza approach, which is maybe everything I'm doing is wrong, and then do the opposite of everything that you've been doing. We went over 3 big methods for setting your rates. How much do others charge based off of that? Number 2, set the rate based on your overhead. This is more if you're planning on launching a full-time business and you really want to plan ahead. You got to think, how much is it going to cost me to run this operation and to live? And then you've got to charge something where you're at least breaking even if you're only booked half the time or so. And then lastly, there's the question of what will the market bear? How much value am I giving? How much is this service worth to the other person in terms of dollars? And then set the rate there. And sometimes you may find that if you can really deliver a good product, if you cost a little bit more, people will actually feel better about paying you than if you cost a little bit less. Anyway, I hope you've really enjoyed this first installment in the new SonicScoop podcast / videocast series, which is as of yet unnamed. If you want to throw out some name ideas for us, we're all ears. I have a few that are floating around, and maybe I'll get you guys to vote on them later. So last but not least, one big shout out to our sponsors for today's podcast. Sound Toys, some of my favorite plugins in the universe. If you don't own Echo Boy, you should own it. If you don't own Devolock Deluxe, you should own it. If you don't own Crystallizer, you should own it. If you don't own the Sound Toys 5 bundle, there's incredible creative tools. I always wish I was doing more mixing than mastering these days so I could use their tools even more often. A lot of fun. Big thank you to Focusrite. Remarkably good interfaces for the price. Really clean, high quality stuff. Thank you so much for sending me my new Focusrite interface that I'm recording through right now. It sounds great. And thank you so much to GIK Acoustics for these beautiful, handsome acoustic panels behind me. It sounds absolutely great in this room right now. Not having to worry about the low-end response to this room, being able to master in a home studio, with complete confidence, is absolutely huge. And it's one of the biggest pieces of the puzzle for any studio, any budding music producer, audio engineer, or musician. You got to get your acoustic treatment together. It's major. All right, guys. Thanks for hanging out with me. See you next time.